I still remember that moment as clearly as an unhealed cut. That night in the dazzling wedding garden of Hollow Ridge Garden, where warm golden lights draped over white silk ribbons as soft as mist, my son, Daniel, looked straight at me and shouted in front of nearly 200 guests, "Mom, go home! Sophie doesn't want you here!" No one said anything, not even a sharp breath. Only the music stopped mid-note, and hundreds of eyes turned toward me as if I had just done something terrible. I stood there in the teal dress I had chosen so carefully to ensure I wouldn't outshine anyone, which ended up becoming the excuse for me being thrown out of my own son's wedding. Daniel looked at me, waiting. Sophie stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm tightly, her eyes cold as if I were a stranger. I didn't cry. I didn't even ask why. I just felt my body grow weightless, as if it were drifting away. I nodded slightly, picked up my purse, and turned to leave the celebration I had helped plan down to the smallest detail. No one stopped me, not a single word of protest. Only the night breeze and the faint scent of lavender trailed along the path beneath my feet. And in that moment, I understood there are things a mother can hear, but never truly forget. Suppose you're listening to this story and feel a sense of connection. In that case, you can follow the channel so we can share more stories about family, forgiveness, and the lessons that help us grow stronger each day. I'm grateful to have you here with me. After leaving the wedding that night, I drove down the dirt road leading back to Silver Creek Ranch, the place I've spent my entire life. Just seeing the weathered wooden gate brought memories rushing back like old film reels. Jonathan, my husband, died when Daniel was only 13. It was a bitter winter morning when the hospital called. I remember standing there, frozen, while Daniel trembled and held my hand, trying to act older than he was. From that day on, the two of us learned how to survive without Jonathan. I rebuilt everything, the books, the livestock, the routines. And Daniel, he grew up faster than I ever thought he would. He used to wake up at 5 in the morning, slipping on boots that were still too big for him, running out to the stables to see if I needed help. He learned how to walk Stormy around the yard, how to patch broken fence boards after a storm, and even how to dry his mother's tears without saying a word. There was a time I told him, "You're still little. Let me handle it." Daniel shook his head, trying to be strong. "You're not alone, Mom. I can do it." He was small and clumsy, but his heart was bigger than this ranch that spans dozens of acres. And during those evenings when we sat together on the porch, drinking hot cocoa and watching the sun dip behind the pine hills, Daniel once said something I never forgot. "When I grow up, I'll keep the ranch just like Dad wanted. I promise." I believed him completely back then. A child may change over time, but their love for family remains constant. I thought that would never fade. Maybe that's why being cast out of the wedding hurt so deeply, because I once believed Daniel was the last person on earth who would ever hurt me. Everything began to change when Daniel turned 27 and met Sophie during a client meeting in the city. Daniel told me she was smart, quick-witted, worked in finance, and completely different from anyone he'd dated before. I simply smiled and congratulated him, never imagining that our family would soon step onto a completely different path. The day Sophie first visited Silver Creek Ranch, she wore a pristine white dress and high heels that had no business being on a dirt road. When Daniel took her around the stables and the barn, she tried to keep her smile, but her eyes couldn't hide the discomfort. "Oh, this place is quite rustic." A light comment, but enough to make my heart sink. Daniel didn't notice. He excitedly showed her every corner of the ranch, every horse, every fence post, just as he always did. But I could see Sophie looking at everything as though it were merely untapped potential. After that visit, Daniel began discussing modernizing the ranch, using the land to make better money, and turning it into a tourism model. Things he had never once mentioned before. At first I thought he was simply growing up, but soon I began noticing the small changes, the kind a mother recognizes instantly. Daniel talked less, spent fewer evenings on the porch with me. Every time I asked about Sophie, he answered more briefly, with an avoiding glance, as if he were afraid of saying the wrong thing. One night, I walked into the kitchen and found Daniel texting, his face tense. When I asked, he said, "It's nothing, Mom, just work stuff." But I knew it wasn't work. I could feel something gently but unmistakably pulling my son away from me. And that feeling was the first warning of what was coming. I still remember the exact moment everything began to fall apart, right before Daniel said the words I will never forget. On the wedding day, I chose to wear a light teal dress, a gentle, modest color, the same shade my mother once loved. I wanted to appear neat and presentable, beautiful enough to feel confident, yet still respectful of Sophie on her big day. When I stepped into the guest reception area, Sophie looked me up and down. Her smile stayed perfectly in place, but something flickered through her eyes. Something hard to describe. She leaned toward Daniel and whispered. I stood only a few steps away and could still hear, "That color. It's too bright. It looks like your mom is trying to draw attention." I froze. I never imagined that a dress color could evoke such a reaction. Daniel walked toward me, his expression unusually tense. "Mom, why did you choose this color?" "Because I thought it was soft and subtle." Daniel shot a glance at Sophie, then back at me, his voice lowering but growing sharper. "Sophie says it makes you overshadow her." I tried to smile to ease the awkwardness, but my lips wouldn't move. "It's all right, honey. I have another dress in the car. I can change." Daniel cut me off, and his quiet voice shifted into something I had never heard from my son. "No. Go home. You're making Sophie anxious. She doesn't want you here." Those words dropped in front of hundreds of people. Someone nearby even dropped a glass. The music stopped. The beautiful wedding space suddenly felt like the coldest place I had ever stood. I felt my heart hollow out, not anger, not defiance, just emptiness. The day that should have been Daniel's happiest became the day he pushed me out of his life, right in front of everyone. I turned and walked away, knowing the door closing behind me wasn't just the hall's door, but the door to a time when I believed my son would never hurt me. The next morning, while I was still trying to steady myself after a sleepless night, my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. Despite the ache in my chest, I answered. He was still my son. "Mom, can you bring me the ranch keys?" His voice was firm and flat, as if he were repeating something someone had told him. I hesitated. "The keys? What do you need them for?" "We want to renovate the main house. Sophie thinks it needs to be a little more modern. For the future." For the future. I heard Sophie's wants before Daniel even said them, and the way he talked about the ranch held none of the affection he once had. I kept my tone calm. "The main house is fine, sweetheart. There's nothing that needs fixing." Daniel sighed, a sigh that didn't sound like my son at all. "Mom, don't make this difficult. It's just the keys. Give them to us so things are easier." A long silence followed, a silence that made the truth loud and clear. Daniel wasn't speaking for himself. He was repeating what someone else wanted. "I can't hand over the keys right now." I spoke slowly, clearly. "It's better if I keep them." Daniel stayed quiet for a few seconds, then spoke in a distant voice. "Sophie says you're always getting in the way. Can you try cooperating for once?" Those words felt like a second cut, lighter than the night before, but deeper. After hanging up, I sat quietly in the kitchen, my hand reaching for the necklace I always wore. Attached to it was a ring of old keys, the ones Jonathan had given me before he passed away. That day, he placed them in my hand and said one short sentence. "Keep these, not to lock anyone out, but to protect what matters." I didn't fully understand his meaning at the time, but that morning, Hearing Daniel's cold voice, I finally felt afraid. Not afraid of losing the ranch, but of losing the very son I had raised with my whole life. 3 days after the wedding, Daniel called again. His voice was a little lighter, but something tight still lingered underneath. "Mom, Sophie and I want to come to the ranch for dinner tomorrow. Can you make the meatloaf I like? Sophie wants to start over." Hearing that, my heart softened. Even though the hurt was still raw, I wanted the family to heal. I agreed. The next day I woke earlier than usual. I handpicked every ingredient, seasoning everything the way Jonathan used to like. I set the table neatly with the special dishes we reserve for only the most essential occasions. Throughout the cooking, I felt both hopeful and anxious, as if each spoonful of spice could shift the atmosphere of the night. Around 7, Daniel's car pulled up. He walked in with a strained smile, and Sophie looked flawless from head to toe, like she was about to appear in an advertisement. Dinner began peacefully enough. Daniel praised the meatloaf like he used to, and it warmed me a little. Sophie tried to be cheerful too, complimenting the house and the food. However, her tone carried a hint of politeness more than sincerity. After the main course, Sophie stood up, saying she needed to fix her lipstick. I tidied up for a bit, but something unsettled me. I walked down the hallway and noticed Jonathan's office door slightly open, something that had never happened when guests were around. When I stepped inside, my heart dropped. Sophie stood at the desk, her phone raised, taking pictures of every document: land maps, tax papers, notebooks, even the property files Jonathan had always kept carefully tucked away. "Sophie," my voice came out rough. She startled, but it took her only a second to regain her composure. "Oh, I just found the room so interesting. Wanted to capture a bit of it." She slipped her phone into her bag and gave a faint smile, as if nothing had happened. But to me, that moment felt like a punch straight to the chest. It was clear. She didn't see me as part of her family. I was just a door she needed to unlock. Or break. After Daniel and Sophie left that evening, I returned to the study, my heart still weighed down. The familiar scent of old wood lingered in the room, yet somehow it felt colder than usual. I walked to Jonathan's desk. The papers were still there, but no longer in their original locations. A few sheets had been shifted, barely noticeable to anyone else. Still, I knew every corner, every crease, every faded ink mark of his. I opened the second drawer, the one where Jonathan kept the yellow envelope. The envelope had never left the ranch. It had never been opened, not since the day he handed it to me and said, "When someone tries to take what isn't theirs, that's when this envelope will need to be opened." The drawer was empty. I froze. It felt as if the floor beneath me had cracked open. I searched the entire room, then the entire house. Every drawer, every wooden box, every corner, even the places I knew held nothing, just to calm myself. But the envelope was gone. The vague unease inside me finally took shape. Sophie didn't just want the keys, she wanted everything. The next morning, while I was still trying to gather my thoughts, the doorbell rang. It was Mr. Carter, the family lawyer who had stood by us since Jonathan was alive. He stepped in with a grave expression. "Margaret, I'm here because this won't be easy to hear." I invited him to sit. My hands were still trembling slightly. "Yesterday, Sophie called me." Mr. Carter looked directly into my eyes. "She said you asked her to inquire about ownership and Daniel's share of the assets. You didn't do that, did you?" "Of course not." "I assumed so." He sighed. "But that's not the real issue. She asked very specific questions. Can Daniel sell his share? Can the ranch be partitioned? And most importantly, whether you could be deemed no longer competent to manage it." I felt my chest tighten. Mr. Carter continued slowly, "Margaret, this is no longer about emotions. This is the first step toward a legal case. And if they decide to claim you're not mentally capable, you could lose control of the ranch." I stayed silent. No panic, no tears. Only one feeling remained. Betrayal was getting closer by the day. 2 days after Mr. Carter's visit, I received a message from Sophie. "Victoria, we need to talk. Lunch tomorrow at Pinewood Bistro. My treat." I hesitated, but my instincts told me avoiding her would solve nothing. So the next day, I arrived a few minutes early. Pinewood Bistro was a small, modestly elegant restaurant, the kind people chose more for business conversations than for meals. Sophie was already there, seated by the window, gently swirling a glass of white wine as if everything were unfolding exactly as she planned. "You're here. Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said, her polite smile lacking any warmth. I sat down, waiting for her to begin. Sophie set her glass down and leaned slightly toward me. "Victoria, I'll be direct. The ranch. It's really too much for someone older to manage. It's too big, too demanding. And you live alone." She paused briefly before continuing. "Everyone eventually has to think about their future. I work in finance. I can clearly see the value the ranch holds. It could become a resort, a tourist destination, or at least bring in stable income." She stopped, her eyes sharpening. "But to make that happen, it needs someone capable of managing it, someone younger, someone who understands the market, someone like me." I listened to every word, not angry, only feeling as though I were listening to a business pitch I never asked for. Then Sophie spoke again, her voice quieter, revealing the first trace of genuine emotion. "You don't understand. I grew up with nothing. I've had to secure everything for myself to make sure I never go back to the life I came from. I need to protect my future and Daniel's. I can't let him stay stuck in these old ranch traditions forever." Then she looked straight at me. "You just need to hand over the keys. Let me take care of the rest." I set my glass down, keeping my voice steady. "Sophie, the ranch is my home. It's where Jonathan placed his trust. I'm not handing it over to anyone." Her smile faded instantly. "Victoria, you're being selfish." "I'm not being selfish. I'm protecting what I have the right to protect." I stood up and placed money on the table for my drink. "Thank you for lunch, but we have nothing left to discuss." As I walked away, I knew with absolute certainty a battle I never wanted had officially begun. That afternoon, the sky over Silver Creek Ranch hung heavy as if rain were coming. I was trimming jasmine by the porch when I heard powerful engines approaching. Not one vehicle, 3. Daniel's familiar pickup truck, a sleek black SUV, and another car bearing the logo of the town's law firm. When they stopped in the yard, I knew something serious was happening, and not in a good way. Daniel stepped out first. His shirt was crisply pressed, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes were red. Sophie followed, one hand resting lightly on her stomach as if to draw attention to what lay beneath her dress. 2 men in suits, each carrying a briefcase, walked behind them. "Mom, we need to talk," Daniel said, his voice heavy. I invited them into the living room. The 2 lawyers sat down with the ease of people accustomed to tense situations. The older lawyer opened his briefcase. "Mrs. Margaret, we represent Daniel Taylor and his wife. They wish to discuss the division of assets related to Silver Creek Ranch." I looked at Daniel. "You want to divide the ranch?" Daniel swallowed hard. Sophie answered for him. "Yes, Daniel and I are expecting a baby. I'm 2 months pregnant. We need to secure our future. The ranch is too big, too old, and not suitable for a young family seeking stability." I froze. I hadn't known. Daniel hadn't told me anything. The lawyer continued. "Daniel has the right to request separation of his share or to request the sale of his portion to ensure the well-being of his growing family." Daniel looked at me again, and this time his voice was sharp. "Mom, give me the keys. I need full access to start renovations and reassess everything." "I can't do that right now," I said slowly. Sophie cut in, her tone sharp as a blade. "Victoria, you're trapping my husband in the past. This ranch is holding him back." I didn't have time to respond before Daniel burst out shouting, "Give me the keys! You never think about me." I looked straight into his eyes, trying to stay steady. "I have thought about you every day of your life, Daniel. You know that." But his following words were the ones that nearly knocked me off my feet. "From now on, I don't have a mother. I can't live with someone who clings to everything for herself." The room suddenly felt darker, even though the lights were still on. I stood there as if swept away by the wind, except no one came to help me up. Daniel turned his back, and Sophie followed. The lawyers closed their briefcases. They left without looking back, and for the first time in many years, the ranch felt terrifyingly vast, because I had never felt so alone. That night, Silver Creek Ranch was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking in the living room. After the door shut behind Daniel and Sophie, I stood alone for a long time, unsure what to do with my trembling hands. I sat down on the wooden chair by the window, the one where Jonathan used to read the newspaper every morning, and then, as if someone had pulled the plug inside my chest, the tears spilled out. I cried for the son I had raised with my entire youth. I cried for the words a mother never expects to hear from her own child. I cried for the truth that no matter how important family is, no one has the right to trample an elder simply because she believes in old values. My tears soaked through my blouse, but I let them fall. Sometimes a person has to hit rock bottom to see the way forward. When I finally steadied myself, I walked into Jonathan's study. In that room that always carried the scent of old pine, I opened the lower drawer, the one where my husband kept copies of essential documents, and just as I sensed, a copy of a letter he had written years ago was still there, tucked deep in the back. I opened it. Jonathan's handwriting was as clear as ever. "Margaret, if you're reading this, it means someone is trying to take what isn't theirs. You are stronger than you think. You have the right to protect what belongs to our family. This ranch is not just land. It's where Daniel learns where he comes from. Hold firm. When the time is right, you'll know." Just a few lines, but enough to make me breathe deeper and stand up straight. Jonathan never spoke much, but when he did, every word struck home. The next morning, I made a short list, complete with big tasks. First, I went to the clinic in town. I requested a comprehensive medical evaluation, including both physical and mental assessments. I wanted paperwork proving I was perfectly competent, so no one could ever use incapacity to force me to sign anything. Second, I went to the bank and opened a safe deposit box. I placed in it the copy of the letter, the property documents, and all ranch-related records. No more rummaging, no more theft. Third, I met with Mr. Carter. I said plainly, "I want to rewrite my will." He looked at me for a long moment. "Are you certain?" "I've never been more certain." In the new will, I decided. The ranch would be protected for 40 years. It could not be sold, divided, or transferred. If Daniel continued to pursue legal action, his benefits would automatically drop to 0. Everything would only pass to him if he proved he respected this place. When I signed it, I felt as though I had closed one door and opened another. Calmer, stronger. Fighting doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means staying silent, then taking steady, deliberate steps. The news of Daniel and Sophie's divorce came on a September morning when Mr. Carter stopped by the ranch with more documents for me to sign. I just finished brewing a pot of tea when he placed the files on the table, looking at me with an expression entirely different from his usual calm. "Margaret, I think you should sit down." I froze. "What happened?" He exhaled heavily. "Daniel and Sophie have been divorced for 3 months." My hand tightened around the teacup. Divorced? But they were expecting a baby. He shook his head. The baby didn't make it. And after that, Sophie moved on very quickly. She's now living with an older businessman in Riverfall. Daniel couldn't handle the shock. He lost his job, left his apartment, and he's currently staying in a motel off the highway. Those words made the floor tilt beneath me. I had to grip the chair to stay steady. I did not feel joy. I did not feel vengeance. I did not feel triumph, only a deep sadness, the kind that comes from watching your own child walk straight into a pit. Life can be fair sometimes, but fairness does not always feel kind. 3 weeks later, while I was in town buying supplies, I saw Sophie. Not in a brief passing glance, I saw her clearly, right before my eyes. She was sitting at an upscale street-side cafe, arms crossed confidently, with a man in a gray suit and an expensive watch beside her. Sophie spoke lightly, smiling with her lips but not her eyes. Those eyes remained cold, untouched by warmth. I stood across the street. I didn't call out. I didn't approach. I simply watched for a few seconds. When she lifted her glass, her gaze brushed past me. Just a fleeting moment, but enough for me to see something I had never seen in her before. Not arrogance, not victory, emptiness. A hollow kind of emptiness, the kind a person keeps trying to fill with money, with new relationships, with the illusion of security they've never been able to build for themselves. She paused, then quickly put her familiar smile back on, as if nothing had happened, as if her entire past with Daniel were just another minor entry in a long list of opportunities she had cycled through. I turned away. No resentment, no lingering thoughts, just the quiet understanding. Some people require no revenge. Life will arrange things on its own. And as for me, I only hope Daniel wouldn't get swept back into that hollow spiral ever again. That morning was colder than usual, a thin mist covering the pasture out front like a soft veil. I was sweeping the porch when I heard a knock on the door, very light, as if the person knocking wasn't sure they should bother me. When I opened the door, Daniel was standing there, thinner than before, dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep, wearing an old jacket with worn shoulders. But what struck me wasn't his appearance. It was his eyes. Eyes that once held confidence and brightness now trembled as if they were about to break. "Mom!" Just one word, but his voice was hoarse and shaking. I said nothing, no blame, no barrage of questions. I simply stood there waiting for whatever he needed to say. Daniel dropped his head, took a deep breath, then let the words spill out through a choked sob. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I was stupid. I let someone else control me. I hurt you. I ruined everything." He covered his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking. For the first time in years, I saw Daniel cry the way he had the day he lost his father, breaking apart in silence, as if even his tears were afraid of disturbing others. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Come inside, honey." We didn't say much. I made him a cup of hot tea. We sat in the kitchen like we used to, just the clock ticking and the faint scent of tea in the air. He finally spoke, exhaling shakily. "I lost everything, Mom. My job, my home, the future I thought I had, but the worst thing I lost was you. I didn't think you'd ever forgive me." I looked at him and said slowly, "Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, Daniel. It's a chance for people to change. I'm still your mother. If you know you were wrong and you want to start over, I'm here." Daniel cried again, this time with relief. No defenses, no pretending. In the days that followed, Daniel stayed at the ranch. The air between us wasn't tense or awkward the way I once feared. He was quieter, but in a gentle way. The silence of someone learning how to stand again. We worked side by side. Daniel fixed the fence that was broken after the storm. I cleaned the stables and prepared the feed. In the evenings, we sat on the porch, watching the sun sink over the fields. Once, Daniel murmured, "I didn't realize. Coming back here would make me feel so peaceful." I answered softly, "The ranch never left you, neither did I." No one brought up the past. No one mentioned Sophie. No harsh words were spoken. We focused only on what truly mattered. A family, when it knows how to hold on to each other, can heal any wound. 5 years passed faster than I expected. Daniel is 38 now. He lives in a small apartment in Willowbend, working as a mechanic at the garage of an old acquaintance. It's not a prestigious job, but he works honestly, diligently, and on time. His boss calls him reliable, a word Daniel hadn't heard directed at him in a long while. Every third weekend of the month, Daniel drives over 3 hours to Dallas to pick up Liam, the 5-year-old boy with brown eyes just like Daniel's when he was young. When the pickup truck turns into the ranch gate, Liam always shouts with excitement, "Grandma, I'm here!" I lift the little boy into my arms, breathing in the sun-warmed scent of his hair. Daniel watches, his expression a mix of gratitude and lingering regret, though far lighter than before. The bond between the two of us has returned, not loud nor rushed, but calm like a stream after the rainy season. Daniel is a gentle father. He teaches Liam to tie his shoelaces, to dig the soil, and to sit on Daisy, the little horse I named years ago. And at night, the two of them sleep in Daniel's old room, the one still marked with the pencil scribbles he drew on the wall when he was 8. Watching them, I know my son has finally grown, not in wealth, but in responsibility. As for Sophie, from time to time I hear bits of news around town. She now lives in a large house in Riverfall, travels often, and owns things others might mistake for happiness. However, people say she frequently changes jobs, quarrels with her new partners, and is often tense. Some things are luxurious, but also very fragile. I don't feel joy about it. I just understand. Individuals who consistently seek more to feel valuable often struggle to find genuine peace. A year ago, I revisited the idea of rewriting my will. Mr. Carter brought the documents and I sat down to write each line myself, not out of anger, but to give Daniel something he earned through a long, painful journey. In the updated will, I wrote, "Daniel will inherit the entire ranch. If over the next 10 years he proves he can care for it, respect its history and never try to sell it. If he cannot keep that promise, or if he somehow falls back into old mistakes, everything will pass to Liam when he turns 25. When I showed Daniel the will, he stood for a long time, saying nothing. Then, in a strained but steady voice, "Mom, I'll try. I promise." I nodded. No need for many words. Some promises once made by a grown man don't need to be proven with speech. Time will reveal them. This afternoon, as I stood on the porch, I watched Daniel helping Liam climb onto the white fence. The boy laughed loudly. Daniel laughed too. The two of them were like patches of sunlight running across the field. I reached for the key I still wore around my neck, a little older now, a little colder, but as strong as the day Jonathan placed it in my hand. Family, no matter how far it strays, is the place we return to. Respecting our elders is a timeless tradition, and forgiveness, for the right person, at the right time, can change an entire life. I smiled and rested my hand on the key. It is still here, and until Daniel is truly ready, I will keep it, not to control, but to wait. Someday, I will give it to him. But today, watching a father and son running in the golden afternoon light, I already feel peace enough for a lifetime.